All right. Hey there, how you doing? I'm sitting in the car, just doing my thing. I'm going to talk about the elements of persuasion. Those remember that image in the last presentation, where if you want a persuasive message to work, they have to pay attention, they have to believe, etc. So let's kind of talk about things that make it more likely that people will move up that chain of persuasion. So first thing is the credibility of the communicator. And so, clearly television commercials are, they show people wearing a white lab coat and, trust me, I'm a doctor, or 8 out of 9 physicians believe, So credible communicators are perceived as expert, are trustworthy. The degree to which the audience believes that they're an expert will indicate how much they're willing to follow them. Okay? The sleeper effect. Whoa, where's my head? The sleeper effect is the idea that the delayed impact of a message occurs when a message that originally was discounted, written off, becomes effective. So we remember the message, but we forget why we blew it off in the first place. It's kind of a strange predicament. Attractiveness. Clearly, attractive communicators are more persuasive communicators. I mean, look at it's Michael Jordan and he's selling you underwear, okay? So clearly there's no expertise involved here because I can't imagine Michael Jordan is an expert on underwear, right? I don't know, what do I know? What makes an expert on underwear? But athletes tend to make very persuasive spokespeople because they're attractive, all right? But it also turns out that similarity is important, that persuasive messages are more persuasive if the message is given by somebody similar to yourself. And interestingly, this is one of the key core principles of social learning, that we tend to imitate children. For example, children tend to imitate people that resemble themselves. The closer they are to resembling themselves, the more they tend to imitate. Here we've got 6 principles of persuasion. Authority. Yes, we've already said this idea that a medical doctor is somehow more persuasive than somebody else. People that we like, okay? If we like somebody, we're more persuaded by them. Social proof. This is just a kind of a way of saying I'm more convinced. In fact, sometimes I go to the customer reviews on Amazon. That's kind of like social proof. I'm going to look at average, ordinary people just like myself and see what they believe. Okay? Reciprocity, repay. I don't know about that one, but consistency. Yeah. If you've made a public commitment to something, then you're much more likely to follow through on it. And scarcity, yeah, that's something else. Okay, scarcity, for persuasion, that's a key to advertising. Limited quantities, come in now. In fact, one of the best elements of persuasion is to get your audience to believe that there's just not enough of them. Okay, and so one of the best ways to sell more products at the grocery store is to put a limit on how many you're allowed to buy. All right, limit 3, so people buy 3. Why? Because that's how many I'm limited to buy. I was only going to buy 1, but when you said it was limit 3, that must be something special about those things that you have to limit it. Right? And we kind of mentioned this already, but well-educated or analytical people are more responsible to a rational and hence central approach to persuasion. People that are thoughtful, involved audiences often travel a central route. Uninterested audience are much more likely to be, or just not just uninterested, but distracted audience, by the way. A distracted audience is more likely to be persuaded by peripheral cues and less likely to be running the central route. And so you can use this to your advantage if you have to persuade somebody of something important. So you just bring in your crying baby, and your crying baby will distract your audience, and you just go from there. Right? Distraction is pretty good for that. Messages associated with good feelings are more persuasive. So in this little study that we're seeing under my head here, what we see is that people were reading a persuasive message either when they had no food or while eating. Okay, and so they were reading about a cancer cure. Is this a persuasive, statement? If they were eating, it was more persuasive. And in every single case, didn't matter what the issue was. If people were eating while the message was playing, or being read in this case, they were more persuaded. Well, how about this? Sometimes fear is a good persuader too, okay? And so what we find is that in most parts of the world, not the United States, cigarette warning labels on packages are required to put these horrible images on there. So arousing fear can do a pretty good job of making a persuasive message stick. Aha, the primacy and the recency effect. When it comes to persuasion, especially if you're trying to weigh two competing arguments, okay, what you find is here. Let's say there's two competing arguments. Heck, you're in a debate, and there's two sides to be debated. Well, the question is this. Let's say two sides are being debated, and both sides want to persuade you to behave for them or vote for them. So, who do you want to go first, or do you not want to go first? Well, it depends. Take a look. If you have message 1 and message 2, and then that is then there's a delay of time, then message 1 is more important. The primacy effect reigns supreme. The first thing you heard is somehow remembered better. But if there's a length of time between 1 and 2, and then an immediate, vote or whatever behavior you're going to measure, message 2 will be much, much more persuasive due to the recency effect, because message 2 is still fresh in your short-term memory, right? This is just a version of the primacy effect and recency effect that you learned in cognitive class or some other class. Now, of course, persuasive messages can be sent through many different channels, and for some audiences and some messages, some channels are more effective than other channels. But clearly the printed word, video, email, word of mouth, right, online, offline, there's just so many ways. Heck, by an airplane pulling a flag in the sky, what do I know? And so here what we see is what was this one? I don't even remember this one. Face-to-face communication, mass media, face-to-face. I see. Percent change in risk. Okay, I see. So the face-to-face message after a heart attack was far more effective than, a mass media or a control group. That makes a lot of sense. So face-to-face is often much more effective than media. But of course, face-to-face requires that the persuader is physically present with the person receiving the message. The audience. Yeah, it turns out that as people get older, they become different, right? Well, that is to say, older people are more conservative. Is it because when people get older, they get more conservative? I know I have, by the way. That's a fact. The older I get, the more conservative I know, Mr. Liberal Professor. But yeah, whatever, okay? Attitudes tend to, according to this notion of why are older people conservative, the basic belief, I don't know if it's true or not, but attitudes don't change. That is to say, the people that are older today grew up at a time when more conservative values were prevalent. And so what happens is these attitudes were formed during adolescence and tended to stabilize with age. I don't know, because as I get older, I started out liberal and I become more conservative, but I don't know. Yeah, we'll see. All right, forewarned is forearmed, okay? So if you're warned about the message before you get the message, you're less likely to be persuaded by it. And in fact, here I had already mentioned this, distraction disarms counter-arguing. If you're busy, then we don't have the ability to think about counter-arguments to the persuasive message. And in fact, here's the other one that I had at least said already somewhere. Where are you? There you are. Uninvolved audiences use peripheral cues, but it's not just uninvolved, but there is a certain personality type. There's a very interesting test. This need for cognition is a personality trait. And what, like, say, for example, you ask the question, the notion of thinking abstractly is appealing to me. And disagreeing with things such as, I only think as hard as I have to. Okay? So, people that are high in need for cognition are likely to say, the notion of thinking abstractly is appealing to me. And somebody high in need for cognition would be likely to disagree with the statement, I only think as hard as I have to. I like that. Although I must say, some days I'm high in need for cognition and some days I'm low. It just depends on, I guess, how much energy I've got today, right? And so, as we had said, people that are high in need for cognition are more likely to be persuaded by the central route than the peripheral route. Oh, there's a need for cognition scale. Blah, blah, blah. Thinking is not my idea of fun. Okay? Not my idea of fun. Strongly agree. High score equals low in need for cognition. So this is a reverse scored item. I like tasks that require little thought once you've learned them. Yeah, that's funny. Okay, so there it is. So the elaboration likelihood model. Okay, so the persuasive appeal, should you use the central route or the peripheral route? Okay, and it really depends upon your audience. It depends on how they process and how much effort they're willing to put in. And what we find is that the central route leads to cogent arguments that invoke enduring agreement. In other words, attitude change that will persist. Okay? Peripheral route, you might trigger acceptance, but it's only temporary. Okay, in the next section, we'll talk about, I believe, extreme forms of persuasion, in particular, cults. Cults. Yes, cults in the next section.